It's a Friday afternoon on the south lawn of the White House. The president leans into a cluster of microphones beside the whirring rotors of Marine One. His tie flutters in the wind. Three aides stand behind him, laughing. For 47 seconds, he dismisses the Canadian economy as a frozen joke, claiming it only survives because of American patience. He calls the Canadian dollar monopoly money with snow on it, and Mark Carney a clerk in a sweater. Then he turns, strides across the grass, boards the helicopter, and lifts off for Camp David. No prepared statement, no policy announcement, no formal message to any allied government. Just 47 seconds of offhand contempt from a casual Friday press gaggle that even the White House Communications Office hadn't briefed the State Department on. The Canadian ambassador was in a meeting in Montreal when the clip hit her phone. She watched it once. She didn't watch it twice. She closed her laptop, picked up her phone, and made a single call to Ottawa that lasted 84 seconds. In those 84 seconds, she said 11 words that 3 separate reporters later reconstructed, and 2 officials in the Privy Council confirmed. "Tell the Prime Minister we don't have to answer this one." The Prime Minister didn't answer. Not that afternoon, not that evening, not on Saturday, not on Sunday. For 72 hours, Canada produced no statement, no rebuttal, no formal protest, no televised response of any kind. And that silence cost the United States between $41 billion and $58 billion. Subscribe and hit the bell, because what comes next is the most precise and devastating example of strategic silence in modern economic history. Once you see exactly how it played out, you'll never look at international trade negotiations the same way again. Before we get to the silence itself, you need to understand what was happening beneath those 47 seconds on the South Lawn. The president wasn't insulting an abstract idea. He was targeting a specific set of numbers his own government had already documented. Every day, not annually, $2.7 billion in goods and services cross the U.S.-Canada border. A Bureau of Economic Analysis report from the previous month showed that bilateral trade with Canada added roughly $1,840 in annual purchasing power to the average American household, verified by 3 independent methods. The Department of Commerce projected that even a 60-day disruption in the integrated relationship would cut U.S. GDP by 0.8 percentage points in the current fiscal quarter. Some 412,000 American jobs in the automotive sector alone depended on supply chains running through Ontario and Quebec. 64% of the crude oil the U.S. imports comes from Canada. 38% of the potash fertilizing American grain comes from one Canadian province. A confidential Federal Reserve briefing the week before warned that the Canadian dollar's role in commodity settlement had grown to the point where a sustained U.S. dollar appreciation against it would drive measurable inflation in American consumer prices within 90 days. Canadian pension funds held around $1.4 trillion in U.S. sovereign and corporate paper, and Canadian banks were the 3rd largest foreign holders of U.S. treasuries. The Canadian dollar, monopoly money with snow on it, was the 6th most traded currency on Earth and the official reserve for 38 central banks. All this while 3 aides laughed behind him, just 3 days before the first quarterly settlement window of a $612 billion non-dollar trade compact in Zurich. Now, here's what Carney understood that the White House communications team apparently didn't. According to 4 officials in the Privy Council, Mark Carney had spent the weekend in 3 separate meetings with the finance minister, the foreign minister, and the governor of the Bank of Canada. Each session reached the same conclusion. Any Canadian response, angry, measured, diplomatic, or dismissive, would only turn a Friday afternoon insult into a Monday morning negotiation. It would hand the American president a stage to perform reconciliation, regaining what his contempt had cost him. Canada's decision was simple: refuse to provide that stage. The strategy was detailed in a 19-page memo from the Privy Council on Saturday morning, later leaked in redacted form. The memo argued that 26 months of confrontation had created a structural inversion in the bilateral relationship. The United States now needed Canadian cooperation more than Canada needed American cooperation. The president, in calling the Canadian economy a frozen joke, hadn't insulted Canada so much as revealed his own misunderstanding of that inversion. The right Canadian response wasn't to correct him. It was to let the markets, allies, central banks, and even Republican senators in farm states do it for them. So, the silence began. And inside that silence, a lot happened. It became the most expensive 72 hours in recent American economic history. At 3:14 a.m. Eastern Time on Monday, the Reserve Bank of Australia released a routine technical bulletin. In paragraph 14 of a 31-page document, a single sentence noted that the bank had completed scheduled rebalancing of its reserve currency holdings. It wasn't flagged, it wasn't press released, it was tucked in an appendix of a quarterly report traders had been reading for 22 years. 4 trading desks in Singapore caught it within 11 minutes. The line item revealed that Australian central bank holdings of Canadian dollar-denominated assets had risen 41% over the previous quarter, while US dollar holdings had fallen 7%. By 4:47 a.m., the Monetary Authority of Singapore posted a similar disclosure. By 5:31, the Bank of Korea followed. By 6:14, the Swiss National Bank confirmed parallel rebalancing in its own quarterly disclosure. By the time U.S. markets opened at 9:30, 4 central banks holding a combined $4.2 trillion in foreign exchange reserves had quietly reduced U.S. dollar exposure in favor of Canadian dollars, euros, and yen. None referenced the South Lawn Statement, and none needed to. At 10:14 a.m., Carney walked to the podium at the Sir John A. Macdonald Building. Charcoal suit, no notes. He spoke for 87 seconds. He never mentioned the president, the South Lawn, the Canadian economy, the dollar, or himself. He acknowledged the routine technical disclosures from the 4 central banks, thanked their governors for the professionalism, and confirmed the Bank of Canada would publish its scheduled disclosure on time. Then he looked into the camera and explained what the weekend meant. Canada had received multiple inquiries from journalists, allies, and trading partners about whether it intended to respond to the Friday remarks. The government considered the question and concluded that the appropriate response had already been given: silence. Not because the remarks didn't matter, but because Canada had spent 2 years building an economy, financial architecture, and network of alliances that no longer required defending itself against any other nation's political barbs. Then he delivered 9 words that would echo across trading floors on 3 continents. Dignity is the asset they cannot tax. He unpacked them on 2 levels. On the surface, they meant exactly what they sounded like. In 26 months of escalating economic confrontation, the U.S. had imposed tariffs, threatened sanctions, restricted market access, demanded structural concessions, and most recently described Canada in terms no responsible head of state would use for an ally. Canada absorbed all of it and kept functioning. The one instrument the U.S. had never possessed, and would never possess, was the ability to tax Canada's dignity. Beneath the surface, the words carried something deeper. In the 21st century, a sovereign nation's durability isn't measured only in GDP, military strength, or reserves. It's measured by the ability to receive insult from a more powerful neighbor and resist turning that insult into compliance or rage. A nation insulted without responding, escalating, or breaking has built something no stronger nation can undo. Dignity, in this sense, is the foundational reserve. Every other asset Canada had built over 26 months rested on it. He repeated the 9 words once more. Dignity is the asset they cannot tax. Then he thanked the journalists and left. Within 5 minutes, the clip was on every cable network in North America, and Warren Buffett, watching from Omaha, called 3 of his portfolio managers. According to one of them, Buffett opened with a sharp observation: every great power in decline mistakes its own volume for strength. The smaller party that refuses to match the volume has already won. Then Warren Buffett went on to explain why. The most costly communication in any negotiation is the one the other side refuses to engage with. A demand that produces no counter-demand is priced as worthless. A threat that provokes no counter-threat is treated as theater. An insult that sparks no reply is read as a confession of weakness by the insulter. Across 70 years of business and geopolitical observation, Buffett noted that the party remaining silent under provocation isn't losing. They've already concluded the exchange isn't worth having. They've calculated that engaging costs more than stepping back. And the markets, allies, and third-party observers then do the work the silent party won't. They assess the provocation, they measure the absence of response, and they recognize which party truly has options. Buffett's sharp line, repeated in client notes from Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, and Morgan Stanley, was this: "Silence is free for the country that built the alternatives. It costs everything for the country that didn't." By the close on Monday, the markets had reacted violently. The S&P 500 fell 2.4% on trading volume 38% above the trailing 30-day average. The Dow dropped 870 points. The Nasdaq lost 3.1%. The US dollar weakened against the Canadian dollar by 3.4%, against the euro by 2.1%, against the yen by 2.8%, and against the Australian dollar by 4.1%. The DXY index saw its largest single-session drop in 7 months, while the 10-year Treasury yield rose 27 basis points as foreign buyers pulled back. Goldman Sachs estimated the 72-hour silence cost a total of $58 billion, $41 billion in market capitalization losses, $9 billion in foregone cross-border trade revenue in manufacturing and energy, and $8 billion in sovereign credit repricing. J.P. Morgan estimated $41 billion, but noted the trajectory was accelerating, while Bloomberg Economics put it at $51 billion. The reactions were immediate and striking. Michigan's governor said the remarks had cost 14,000 contract renewals over the weekend. Ohio's governor reported 3 Canadian energy companies had paused cross-border infrastructure talks within 48 hours. Texas's governor said refinery operators had asked whether the federal government realized 64% of the crude they processed came from the country just called a frozen joke. A senior Iowa senator said potash importers received a single advisory from Saskatchewan suppliers that shipments wouldn't be commented on. A Pennsylvania senator reported similar communication from Ontario steel suppliers. The CEO of Ford confirmed that 3 contingency plans, shelved since last summer, were now being accelerated. ExxonMobil's CEO told CNBC that North American operations were now planning around a structural assumption of permanent bilateral political risk. The Business Roundtable, the National Association of Manufacturers, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce jointly called for urgent congressional review of communications protocols governing public remarks on allied economies. All of this stemmed from Canada's preparation, the infrastructure Buffett was pointing to when he said silence is free for the country that built alternatives. Over 26 months, Canada had built new trade partnerships, financial systems, energy routes, alliances, non-dollar settlements, and sovereign trade compacts. Each step moved Canada further from a position where a response to a Friday insult was necessary. By the time the South Lawn statement landed, Canada had created a situation where silence was an option, and the markets knew it. The 4 central bank disclosures between 3:14 a.m. and 6:14 a.m. Monday weren't reactions to the silence. They were confirmations of months-long assessments. Canada had passed a threshold. It no longer depended structurally on American goodwill. Any Washington communication treating Canada as dependent revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the 2026 relationship, not the 2016 one. The Privy Council memo had already identified this underlying assumption. The White House communications strategy assumed that public contempt for a smaller economy would produce one of 2 outcomes. Either Canada would respond angrily, allowing Washington to claim provocation, or, deferentially, allowing Washington to claim respect. Neither happened. Canada didn't respond, and in the absence of response, the markets, allies, and U.S. political system interpreted the silence as the costliest communication a country can make, saying nothing, yet forcing the other side to bear the consequences of its own words. Here's where we stand. The President of the United States stood on the South Lawn and called the Canadian economy a frozen joke, the Canadian dollar monopoly money with snow on it, and the Canadian Prime Minister a clerk in a sweater. The remarks lasted 47 seconds. 3 aides laughed. The President boarded Marine One and left for Camp David. The Canadian ambassador, watching from Montreal, made a single 84-second call to Ottawa. For 72 hours, the Canadian government issued no response of any kind. During that time, 4 central banks controlling $4.2 trillion in reserves quietly reduced their US dollar exposure. On Monday morning, Mark Carney spoke for 87 seconds and delivered 9 words that would become legendary. Dignity is the asset they cannot tax. By Monday's close, the United States had absorbed between $41 and $58 billion in losses. The dollar had weakened against every major currency. Governors, senators, and Fortune 500 CEOs publicly acknowledged measurable damage to states, companies, and constituents. Warren Buffett explained from Omaha why silence costs nothing for the country that built alternatives and everything for the one that didn't. The question now being asked in central banks, state capitals, and boardrooms from Detroit to Dallas is this: when the most powerful tool your neighbor has is the ability to say nothing about what you say, what have you built if you're still the country that must speak first? Dignity is the asset they cannot tax.